had known when I started. Over the course of this podcast, I'll discuss my story, various homeschool educational philosophies and pedagogies, curriculums, socialization, the history of our compulsory education system, otherwise known as public schooling, preparing for college and the future, how we've lost the hearts of our children and how to get those hearts back, and many, many other important topics and things regarding the most precious gifts that we have, our children. So with that, let's get started. My friends, I am very excited to speak with you today and have you join me today for my podcast. Welcome. Now, first of all, before we get started, I want to clarify something. I am not an attorney. I'm not going to pretend to be an attorney. So please don't take anything that I say on this podcast, School to Homeschool, as legal advice. Please seek an attorney if you do have questions that are legal questions that I will not answer for you. Sorry, friends. But I am excited to have you here today. Right off the bat, so my situation is a little bit unusual in that when I decided to homeschool, first of all, I really never thought I'd be a homeschooling mom. Frankly, everyone that I knew growing up that homeschooled, although the kids were really nice, I thought they were weird, right? And so that was my whole view of homeschooling. What I've learned is the weird ones usually are the loudest ones, and there's a lot of really normal homeschoolers. Plus, what does weird mean anyway? But my experience with homeschoolers growing up was I think what most people's experience is growing up. In the 80s and 90s, there was very few homeschooling families. The movement was starting to just take root. Now there's quite a few, and it's not as unusual, particularly since COVID. It's not quite as unusual for people to homeschool. But it was never really on my radar. I had been a public school teacher. Granted, I was a theater teacher. I taught middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I didn't teach for super long. I went back, got an alternative certification, and then became a teacher. But even as a teacher, I thought, oh my gosh, I would never homeschool. I would never homeschool my kids. Sorry, I would never do it. Never say never, my friends. But when I decided to homeschool, I didn't have a lot of resources. And the people that I knew who had homeschooled had either always homeschooled or they took their kids out in elementary school and then would put them into school right before high school. Well, this is where I was a little bit unusual in that I had, at the time when I started homeschooling, I had one going into 7th grade, one going into 8th grade. My second son had just graduated from high school. My oldest son had an associate's degree and had graduated from a charter school same time that he finished with his associate's degree. And then I had an elementary, one going to 3rd grade, and then a preschooler going into kindergarten. And so I couldn't find anybody who had withdrawn them right before high school, except for one friend who ended up putting her son back in. And I felt like I was in a little bit of uncharted territory. And we're going to talk here in a minute about why we chose to homeschool, but it was scary for me. And even though I was a teacher, I was a theater teacher. I was not a science teacher. I was not a math teacher. I was a fun elective teacher. People wanted to come to my class. And so it was still very daunting for me to homeschool. And there was a lot of things that I thought I knew about education that I really had to let go of. But let's get into it just a little bit about why people homeschool and why you might be listening to this. I decided to do a podcast because I get asked a lot of questions from a lot of parents, and that's only grown since I've started homeschooling. Particularly about, I'm thinking about homeschooling my child because I've heard parents say, I'm concerned about the politics that are in the school. I'm concerned about the laws that are being passed in my state about education or about sex education. I'm concerned about the violence in schools. One mom I talked to in Denver, in her daughter's high school this past year had 3 school shootings and they didn't even all make the news. And she's very concerned about the violence. Another parent I talked to said, look, I really want to travel more with my kids, but I feel like the school stifles my ability to travel more with my kids. I've talked to parents who have said, I've been thinking about homeschooling because I want to spend more time with my kids. I don't want them to be 8 hours a day in school. Another mom was frustrated with the school because the school didn't have enough resources. Great school, wealthy neighborhood, didn't have enough resources to get her children, there was more than one, into the classes that they wanted. And so they had to take other classes that they didn't want or need. And so whatever the reason is that you're deciding to homeschool or even thinking about it, know that your reason is legitimate and it's okay. And they're your kids. And you have the right to want what's best for them and then do what's best for them because they're your kids. So let's talk about why we started homeschooling, because why we started and why we keep homeschooling are not necessarily the same thing for our family anyway. As I mentioned, I was a teacher. I'm actually still a licensed K through 12 teacher in the state of Colorado. I have not ever taught in Colorado. I instead married. I have 6 children, as I mentioned. My oldest 2 are my stepkids. However, I raised them, so they're my kids. And I was homeroom mom for years with most of my kids. So I have a child that's now 24, one that's 21, one that is now 16, one that is now 15, one that's 11, and one that's 7. So I've got the whole range of kids in my life. My oldest 2 kids, as I mentioned, my oldest son graduated from a charter school with an associate's degree as well. He did concurrent enrollment. My second oldest son graduated from a public high school. And then I had, as I mentioned at the time, a child going into 8th grade, a child going into 7th grade, a child going into 3rd grade, and then a preschooler. So that's where we were when we started homeschooling. It was, COVID was really kind of the catalyst, I think, that led me into it. When COVID hit, I, like everyone else, was concerned and scared and nervous and didn't know what to expect, but something magical happened to our family. Now, I've heard horror stories about families that had just a terrible experience during COVID. Our experience was actually pretty beautiful. When COVID hit, my kids were involved with like everything, every extracurricular activity, sporting event, everything. I was a taxi mom. And when suddenly everything shut down and we couldn't do anything, we had all this time on our hands. And I loved that I didn't have to taxi my kids anywhere. I loved it. The other thing that I really loved is that my kids and I started spending, we had great time. Now, my husband was considered an essential worker, so he would continue to work. And I was with the kids and we would cook and we started reading every day as a family. And we started, listening to audiobooks and watching movies. And then I would try to help my kids with their online learning as best as possible. Heaven bless those teachers that were trying their very best to do it all while still being parents and trying to teach online. And so I'd help them with their studies. I know that there was a lot of parents that were shocked and saw some of the things that their kids were learning in school. I wasn't. I had a pretty good relationship with my kids. And I was in the classroom also helping out with the teachers. And so I had a handle and a grip on what was being taught in my kids' classroom, and nothing alarmed me that was being taught. But I did observe that they weren't learning as much. And I realized when I started talking to my kids that while they're at school, there was such a limited time, which made sense because when I was a teacher, I saw this too, where there were so many transitions that the actual learning piece was pretty short. And so that kind of took me back and I thought, okay, they can learn in short little spurts. But I dismissed that. During COVID, I wasn't thinking that last end of the school year in 2020, I wasn't thinking we should homeschool, but I was enjoying the time with my kids. I was loving going to the park. We have a big regional park close to my house. And we would go hiking and we'd set up a hammock and no one was around. We couldn't go to a regular park because they taped off the slides and they took down the swings and everything. But I loved the time that I had with them going to the park. We started playing the ukulele and I kind of felt like Fraulein Maria from Sound of Music with my kids. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But again, my plan was in the fall, we finished out the school year, and in the fall, they were going to go back to school. That was the plan. And in the beginning of July of 2020, I ran into my middle school kids' principal at Target. And like I said, I was very heavily involved in the schools. And so I ran into him at Target and I said, hey, what's the plan for the fall? And of course, he didn't know. He was like, I'm not sure. I'm like, well, school's supposed to start in just a few weeks here. No idea. And he's like, nope, I have no idea. We haven't gotten any directive from the school district. So I don't know. It could be hybrid learning. It could be online. It could be any number of things. I'm not sure. And I thought, interesting. Well, I really don't think I'd want my kids necessarily in a hybrid situation. I didn't feel like online learning for as much as the teachers tried, I didn't feel like it was super effective. But I put it in the back of my head. Now, I am a God-fearing person. I'm unabashedly a God-fearing person. And so for those of you who are not God-fearing, this might seem strange to you. For those of you that are God-fearing, not so strange. Again, I wasn't planning on homeschooling until one day I was sitting at church. It was towards the end of July, and I had this very distinct thought: you need to homeschool the kids. It's taken a pandemic, and you're to homeschool the kids. And the thought came with such force into my heart that I couldn't stop thinking about it. And church ended. I went home, and I just couldn't get that thought out of my head. Now, I believe that thought was some divine intervention. That's what I personally believe, because I couldn't get the thought out of my head. So that day I called everyone I knew who homeschooled, and it felt so scary. Like the thought scared me. And normally I would just dismiss something like that, but I couldn't. I could not dismiss that thought that I needed to homeschool the kids. So I called every person that I knew who homeschooled, and which was not a ton of people. But I started calling and saying, hey, why did you homeschool? What made you make that choice? And their reasons were all different. And then when I'd say, well, why do you keep homeschooling? The reasons were all really similar. I've come to learn more about my children than I ever thought was possible. It's been so delightful watching them grow. I feel closer to them. We have a very close family. It's been beautiful, like all these things. And it kind of surprised me. And so again, the thought was still there, and I started to cry. And by the afternoon, I was like, whew, because church was in the morning. And I talked to I think probably 10 people that I knew who homeschooled, but they were all so confident. And I'd ask all the questions like, well, what about socialization? What about math? What about science? What about this? What about that? What about going into college? And they're like, yeah, it's all going to be fine. Like, kids are pretty stinking smart. And so they all gave me all these different reasons that they homeschool and what to do. And I went to my husband that afternoon and I said, hey, honey, I had this thought and I can't get it out of my head. It's been all day, which for some of you might seem like really rash, but if you knew me, like, if I feel like something has to happen, I will make an adjustment and make it quickly in my life. Like, people who know me know that I don't beat around the bush. So I went to my husband and I said, hey, I had this thought to homeschool. What do you think? And my expectation was that he would be like, absolutely not. Homeschool kids are weird. All the things that I thought. And he said, I actually think it would be awesome. I've secretly always wanted you to want to homeschool, but I've never wanted to push you to homeschool. I'm like, you've never even mentioned it. And he's like, right. Again, you'd be the one doing it, not me. And I never wanted to push you to do that. And so, but I had all these internal fears, right? He was all for it. He was all about it. He thought it was great. But there were still some struggles that I had inside. What if I fail? What if I mess them up? What if I can't prepare them for college or the future? What if they come to me what if I do it wrong and then like the ominous they come and try to throw me in jail? Meaning, I don't know, school officers, the government. I didn't know who. Like, what if I did something wrong? What if I decide to put them back into school and they're super behind? What if they become weird? I had all these what ifs. But I, again, couldn't shake that thought. You need to homeschool the kids. And so finally, I made the decision, did a little bit of prayer, some soul searching. My husband was all for it. I let the kids know. I said, hey, I think, this year is really uncertain. I think we're going to take you out and homeschool. They weren't thrilled, but they weren't against it. And my second oldest son had just graduated. He was a 2020 graduate. So he's like, I don't care, but the others I was really worried about. And so what we finally did is I made the decision. I looked up the state laws, had to kind of muddle through things, trying to figure it out, filled out the paperwork. And then the day that I took it into the school district, my friends, my hands were literally shaking. And again, all of those fears were in my head going, what if they end up in therapy? I'm like, oh shoot, they're already going to be in therapy. That homeschooling's not going to do that for them. Right. So I'm like, okay, I'm doing it. And I knocked on our school district had to knock on the door because again, COVID was still going on. Knocked on the door and I handed in my paperwork shaking, and it was very anticlimactic. The lady said, okay, thank you. Here's a homeschooling packet. If you have any questions, here's some tips and tricks for you. Good luck. That was it. And then this weight came off my heart. And I thought, okay, now the real work begins. So in our state, once you submit, I'm in Colorado, once you submit your notice of intent to homeschool, which legally I didn't have to, as a licensed K through 12 teacher, I didn't have to, but I decided to I don't know. I was worried. I was worried that somebody would come after me, which is ridiculous, but I was worried, right? And so what ended up happening was I was like, okay, I need to know all the legalities. Again, I looked up on our Department of Education website for my state and looked up what I legally needed to do. And I had to submit what's called a notice of intent, which says I'm going to homeschool my kids for X amount of days, X amount of hours per day. And there we go. Okay. So I sat there going, okay, so the next thing I need to do is find curriculums. And a couple homeschooling families were like, oh, you'll need a deschool first. And I'm like, wait, what? What the heck is that? And they're like, yeah, you'll want a deschool. And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. So they're like, no, you'll need to detoxify from the school system. I'm like, that's ridiculous. And no. Well, I did, but not then. So I started looking for curriculums and I started calling around saying, what curriculum should I use? And every single homeschooling family told me a different curriculum. And I was like, okay, I don't know what to do. So I was like, well, that one seems nice. So I started looking online at the different curriculums and I was like, oh, this one looks good. And this one, so I need math and I need science and I need this and I need that. And I need all of these. These are the curriculums I need. And I need them all for all of the children, all of my cherubs at home. I have 4 left and I'm going to do this. So I decided, I picked a day and I said, okay, August 24th, we're going to officially start homeschooling. That's the date. That's going to be our official start date. And then I started reading homeschooling books. And that's when my world kind of went, what? oh my goodness, I had no idea. So one of the things that I never learned about is all these homeschooling philosophies that were out there. And none of my education classes did they ever discuss these other philosophies, right? Not ever. And so I was introduced to the Charlotte Mason philosophy, the Maria Montessori philosophy, the Waldorf philosophy. I learned about, I hadn't learned about unschooling yet. I heard about unschooling. And then there was, all these, the Thomas Jefferson education model and just all of these different models. And my mind was like exploding. So I read and I started to read and read and read. And again, like August 24th, that was the day I was going to start homeschooling. I bought school supplies. I bought all these curriculums. I spent an obscene amount of money. My friends don't do that. Obscene amount of money on curriculums that I really didn't need because in the long run, we didn't end up using all of them or continuing with them. And I read and I read and I read and I read and I read. And I was shocked at all these different ways that you could teach your kids. Again, things that they never discussed in my education classes. And then I started reading about the history of our education system. Again, that was never discussed in any of my education classes to become a licensed and certified teacher. And I started getting really disgusted and angry because the more that I learned about the history of our system and now the more that I continue to learn, because there's a lot to our educational system, which was established first in Massachusetts in 1852 by Horace Mann, who was always lauded as this great person. Learning about him and going, oh, no, not so great. Oh, the intention behind why they started a public school system was not great. Like all of those things started to switch my perspective on schooling, period, and on education. And it opened my eyes. And part of me was really frustrated that I never learned about those things when I became a teacher, because I was required to go through a whole certification program and take hours and hours and hours of different education classes, but never was told how it started and why it started. And I started getting really frustrated. In the meantime, I'm learning all these really beautiful educational philosophies. Now, I didn't learn this all in 2 weeks, right? In the first 2 weeks, I just read a couple books, and that was kind of opening my eyes. Or the 4 weeks, however long. I'm trying to remember how long, ever it was 2 or 3 weeks before I started homeschooling my kids. I had ordered the curriculums and I was waiting for the curriculums. But I got the curriculums, I got that all going, and I was reading and reading and reading. And my eyes were opened and I was like, okay, I actually might never put them back into the system after what I've learned about this system that we've adopted in the United States. There are far better ways for children to learn, and I'm going to teach my kids those things. So I got the curriculums. People kept telling me, don't do school at home. And I didn't understand what that meant. And still I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't understand what that meant when they were like, don't do school at home. So I'm like, okay, I don't know what that means, but I've got the curriculums. And by the way, that's what it means. You don't have to use curriculums. You don't have to have everything divided up, according to subject and do it in order. But I did. I was like, okay, so we've got the school supplies. We have the date that we're going to start. I wrote out the day's schedule of what we were going to do that day. And I was going to be done by, 1 o'clock or 1:30. And I was so excited. And the kids were nervous about this. And so the first day came and I had their curriculums laid out. And I had a different curriculum for my high schooler than I did for my elementary school child. And he was in middle school at the time, but he was using high school curriculums because he was advanced. So I had everything laid out. I was so excited. And the day came and we woke up and we got together and we all met in the living room and I had everything laid out for them. And we started, I'm like, here is our schedule. And the kids are like, wait, what? We have to have a specific schedule? I mean, oh, okay. And they started having a really hard time. Like we go through one lesson. I was like, okay, first we're going to memorize a poem and then we're going to do this. And everything was like ordered just like it is in school. First we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, you know, and it was terrible. I mean, it was terrible. The kids started fighting and they don't want to do this and they want to go back to public school because it was terrible and it was awful and blah, blah, blah. And I was crying and they were crying and it was an awful, awful, awful first day. I mean, it was a terrible first day. So by 12 or 12:30, I had gone through their curriculums. They fought me through everything. They were frustrated. I was frustrated. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to put them back in tomorrow. We're done. I'm done. Day one and done. And then something happened. I get a knock at the door and I forgot that I had scheduled a guy to come tune our piano that day. So I went down upstairs. The knock on the door came. I opened the door. I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot you were here. You were coming. Go ahead. Here's the piano. Start tuning. Thank you for coming. And so he starts to tune. I go back downstairs to keep them on task to do their curriculums that I had ordered. By golly, we're going to get through the curriculums. And one by one, they slowly inched their way upstairs to where the piano tuner was. We were in the basement. He was on the main floor, and they inched their way up until I found myself after a few minutes completely alone. But I could hear the piano playing upstairs and it was very, very quiet. The piano would play and I assumed the kids like went up to the upstairs to play video games or something, even though I was like, you cannot play video games. I go upstairs and the kids are surrounding the piano tuner and he's got I don't even know what the name of that part of the piano is, but the front off, and he's showing them the mallets and he's got a tuning fork and he's explaining to them about how sound works. And he hits the tuning fork and he talks to them about vibration and sound waves and what he's doing and the math that's involved in pianos and the octaves and how Pythagoras had come up with this and all these things. And my friends, my kids were totally, totally engaged in everything that he was saying. 100% engaged, more than they had been the entire morning, more than I think that they probably had ever been in school. And I sat there and frankly, instead of thinking, wow, this is beautiful, that little prideful part of my heart went, what? They need to be learning. Get downstairs. And then I stopped myself and went, oh, wait. Oh my gosh. They're totally engaged. They're listening to everything. My daughter pulled out her cell phone. Now, my kids don't have smartphones. They have dumb ones. And so she pulls out her Gab phone, is the brand that we use because it can't do anything at all except for call and text and record. And she's recording him talking and she's recording him playing because he then would play a song and then he'd show them about this, about the tuning fork and all of them. I mean, you could hear a pin drop from them. Like they were so quiet, totally. And they would ask him really, really thoughtful questions that I assumed children would not ask. Right. I have always known my kids are smart, but that's the first time that I went, oh my gosh, children are actually really brilliant. So they're asking him really thoughtful questions about sound, about music, about all of these things. And he was eating it up. And he played for them and tuned the piano while they were sitting there. Loved the captive audience. And then I stopped and went, oh my gosh, I'm an idiot. Here I am trying to shove these curriculums down these kids' throats. There's got to be a better way to learn than this. I mean, I've been reading about some different ideologies, right? Because again, I had just started delving into these ideologies and these different all these different methodologies of teaching and of learning and all the things. And I thought I've got some more research to do myself. So he finished, the kids loved it. He left, and then the kids wanted to take turns trying to practice playing the piano, which they had never wanted to just practice on their own. And for the first time, they were fighting over, no, I get to play the piano next. No, I'm going to play my song next. No, I want to listen to the octaves next. And I was like, what the heck just happened? Oh my gosh, what the heck just happened? So we finished out the day. I didn't even finish with the curriculums. I'm like, you know what? We're done. We're done homeschooling for today. We'll try again and tomorrow. And then I got on the phone and I called my friends that homeschooled. I said, you mentioned something about deschooling. What is that? And what does that mean? Okay, I'm humbled now. I'm willing to listen. What does it mean to deschool your kids? And we're going to talk about this in another episode, but I'm going to give you the short gist of it. We are conditioned that school should be a certain way, that things should be divided up by subject, that we should have so much time on each subject, and then we move on to the next thing. But in natural, normal life, that's not how things work. That's not how learning works. As the piano tuner showed my children, he was talking about math. He was talking about science. He was talking about music, all with one subject, right? That's the natural order of things, is that everything is combined, that we live in an integrated world, not a separated world. And so I had to learn what deschooling was. And essentially deschooling is detoxifying or deprogramming what we know that we think that education looks like, how we see learning and education. I had to detoxify, and the kids had to go through that. The rule of thumb is, for every month that a child is in school, for every year that a child is in school, it will take a month to deprogram that child. But the hardest person it is to deprogram is the parent. And so we went through we had to go through the deschooling process. And I put away all the curriculums except for reading, writing, and math. And everything else, I said, we're not going to worry about anything else. And we're going to spend the next few months just bare minimum of a curriculum. And then beyond that, we're going to just go to museums. We're going to do read alouds as a family and continue that. We're going to continue to go to the park and go hammocking. And since nobody's there anyway, I don't know. I hope I don't get arrested because we were hammocking and we weren't supposed to. Who knows? I thought we could. But we started the deschooling process. By the end of the year, I learned about the unschooling philosophy, which is essentially child-led learning. And by the end of the year, and again, I'll talk more about this in the future, we had moved into predominantly unschooling. I'm what's called a relaxed homeschooler or an eclectic homeschooler, meaning that I don't adhere to one set philosophy. I mostly unschool, but I'm not an unschooling purist, because I still have a curriculum for phonetical reading for my daughter. I still have them do my younger kids do specific math. There's certain things that I expect them to learn, but beyond that, we tend to be more on the unschooling spectrum. So we're called relaxed homeschoolers or eclectic homeschoolers, because we've moved away from using set curriculums for everything and expecting certain things. And I've had to learn about, okay, how do you navigate through college and high school? As of right now, my now 16 and 15-year-olds just finished their freshman year of college, their first year of college. My daughter made the dean's list. My son made the president's list. And people go, well, your kids are really, really smart. That's why. I'm like, no, actually they are smart. That's true. But I've come to realize that all kids are really smart. But if you can set up the right environment in your home, wow, can kids really flourish when it comes to education, and they can love learning. And my children legitimately and sincerely love learning. They don't hate school like everyone else I talk to. And so that's where we ended up, is a relaxed homeschooling model. Again, I'm going to talk about the different philosophies that you can look into, the different options that are out there. If the thought of doing curriculums all the time makes you want to vomit, know that it's okay. It also, well, now it makes me want to vomit. I think, oh my gosh, if I had to sit down with a curriculum with all of them, with everything, it'd be awful. But it's amazing how much our kids can learn at home. And we underestimate our kids. Don't underestimate your kids. Now, if you have kids that have issues like ADHD and things like that, I do have a couple kids with ADHD. I have one child with sensory processing disorder, and homeschooling has been a beautiful switch for us. Again, I will be sharing with you my different philosophies and the things that I've learned over the last 3 years, which have been really, really eye-opening. My friends, our kids deserve us, and they deserve better than what the system offers them, which is not great. And so I'm excited to be able to share all of these things that I've learned with you and the things that I continue to learn as you start to really think and get the courage to move potentially to homeschooling. This is something I'm very near and dear and passionate about. Again, I believe your kids deserve better. And I know that you want them to have better. And even though you feel totally inadequate, even though you have so many fears, and I know you worry that you're going to mess them up, and I know you worry that they're not going to get into college, and I know you worry about all these things, I promise you it'll all be okay, and you will do amazing. You are going to do amazing. So let's start this journey together. I'm excited to